Imagine a city that was, at one time, the beating heart of the medieval world. Cobblestone streets filled with merchants, scholars, priests, and beggars, all living shoulder to shoulder, all breathing the same cold morning air. The year is 1347. Paris is alive. Paris is loud. Paris is full of hope. But something dark and invisible is already moving across the sea. Crawling through the ports of Sicily, creeping through the trade routes of Italy, and slowly, silently, making its way toward France. Nobody in Paris knows it yet. They are going about their lives, completely unaware that in just a few months, their world will never, ever be the same again. To truly understand what happened to Paris in 1348, you first have to understand what Paris was before the plague arrived. This was not a small, quiet town. Paris, in the mid-14th century, was one of the largest cities in all of Europe, with a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 people. Think about that for a moment. 250,000 human beings packed into a city that had no sewage system as we know it today, no clean running water, no understanding of germs, no concept of disease transmission. The streets were narrow and dark. The buildings leaned into each other from both sides, as if they were whispering secrets. And the river Seine, the great river that cuts through the heart of Paris, was not a beautiful, romantic waterway. It was a dumping ground. Animal waste, human waste, the blood of slaughterhouses, the refuse of daily life, all of it poured into that river, and from that river, people drew their water, their fish, their lives. The markets of Paris were extraordinary and chaotic. On the Île de la Cité, the island in the middle of the Seine where Notre Dame Cathedral stood in all its Gothic glory, vendors would sell bread and spices and cloth. Around the Grand Châtelet, butchers hung their meat in open air, and the smell was something you and I cannot truly imagine. Rotting offal, animal blood, unwashed bodies, tallow candles, horse manure, all of it mixed together under a sky that was often gray and sunless. And yet, in this filth and chaos, there was also beauty. There were the sounds of church bells ringing out across the rooftops every hour, the voices of students arguing philosophy near the University of Paris on the left bank, the laughter of children running through alleyways, the prayers rising from dozens of churches and chapels scattered throughout the city. Paris was messy and magnificent. It was alive in the most human of ways. And then, January of 1348, the whispers began. Merchants coming in from the south brought stories with them, terrible, unbelievable stories. A sickness, they said, a sickness unlike anything anyone had ever seen. People in Italy, in Marseille, in Avignon, were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands. The descriptions were horrifying. A person would wake up feeling fine, and then by afternoon, they would feel a strange pain in their armpit or their groin. By the evening, a swelling would appear, hard, dark, hot to the touch, the size of an apple, some said, or an egg. These swellings, these terrible lumps that we now call buboes, gave the disease its name, the bubonic plague. And then, within days, sometimes within hours, the person would begin to bleed beneath their skin, great dark patches spreading across their body like shadows. They would develop a fever so intense that it seemed as if they were burning from the inside. They would begin to cough up blood, and then they would die. Sometimes within 2 days of the first symptom, sometimes in less than 24 hours. The people of Paris heard these stories, and they did what people have always done in the face of incomprehensible horror. They tried to rationalize it. The church said it was God's punishment for sin. The scholars at the University of Paris issued an official statement, a formal medical explanation, declaring that the plague was caused by a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the year 1345, which had released a corrupting miasma, a poisonous vapor, into the air. This was, of course, completely wrong. But it was the best explanation that the finest medical minds of the time could offer. And so the people of Paris prayed, and they looked to the sky, and they waited. They did not have to wait long. By the spring of 1348, the plague had arrived in Paris. And when it came, it did not come quietly. It came like a wave, sudden and overwhelming, crashing into the city with a force that no prayer, no potion, no astrological theory could stop. The first deaths were scattered, isolated, a merchant here, a washwoman there. But within weeks, people were dying by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The hospitals of Paris, which at that time were not hospitals as we know them, but were rather religious institutions run by monks and nuns, places of prayer and charity as much as medical care, were quickly overwhelmed. The Hôtel Dieu, the oldest hospital in Paris, which sat right next to Notre Dame Cathedral, became a place of absolute horror. Patients were packed into beds, 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 at a time. The sick lay next to the dying. The dying lay next to the dead. The nuns who worked there, bless their souls, they did not run. They stayed. They cared for the sick, knowing full well that they themselves would likely die, and many of them did. It is said that in some periods of the outbreak, the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu were dying faster than they could be replaced. Outside the hospital, the streets of Paris transformed into something out of a nightmare. At first, the dead were buried with proper ceremony, with priests, with prayers, with family members weeping over graves. But as the weeks passed and the deaths multiplied, ceremony became impossible. There were not enough priests. There were not enough gravediggers. There were not enough coffins. The churchyards of Paris began to overflow, the bodies stacking up faster than they could be buried. Special mass graves were dug, great long trenches in the earth, where body after body was laid, covered with a thin layer of lime, and then covered over when they could hold no more. The smell of death hung over the city like a permanent fog, thick and sweet, and absolutely suffocating. And through all of this, the people of Paris tried to understand what was happening to them. Who was getting sick? Was it possible to avoid it? The answers they came up with were desperate, sometimes cruel. Some people believed the plague was spread by bad air, the miasma theory. And so they burned aromatic herbs and spices in their homes. They carried small pouches of herbs around their necks. They held scented cloths to their faces when they walked through the streets. Some physicians recommended that people should not bathe, because opening the pores of the skin would allow the miasma to enter the body more easily. This advice, sadly, probably made things worse, since bathing in cleanliness, even in limited ways, would have helped reduce the spread of fleas, which were the actual carriers of the disease. But nobody knew about fleas. Nobody knew about bacteria. Nobody knew anything really. They were stumbling in the dark. The social fabric of the city began to tear apart. This is perhaps the saddest, most heartbreaking part of the whole story. Human beings are social creatures. We reach toward each other in times of crisis. We gather together. We comfort one another. But the plague made that natural human impulse deadly. If you held your sick child's hand, you might die. If you sat with your dying mother, you might die. If you kissed your dead husband on the forehead before they carried him away, you might die. And so people began to withdraw from each other. There are accounts, terrible, heartbreaking accounts, of parents abandoning sick children, of husbands fleeing from sick wives, of friends crossing the street to avoid friends. The Italian writer Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence around the same time, described how some people shut themselves in their homes and refused to see anyone at all, while others went in the completely opposite direction and decided to eat and drink and be merry, spending their days in taverns and feasting and dancing, reasoning that if death was coming anyway, they might as well enjoy whatever time they had left. Paris saw both of these responses. Both were born from the same source, absolute, overwhelming fear. The wealthy had options that the poor did not. Those with money could flee the city, could retreat to their country estates, could put distance between themselves and the diseased streets of Paris. King Philip VI of France left Paris during the worst period of the outbreak. Many nobles and wealthy merchants did the same, and this created a terrible, bitter divide. The poor were left behind, packed into their cramped neighborhoods, breathing the same contaminated air, unable to escape, unable to buy expensive treatments from physicians, unable to do anything but endure. The plague was, in this way, deeply unjust. It was not entirely equal in who it killed. It struck the poor with particular ferocity, because the poor lived in closer quarters, ate less well, had weaker immune systems,